So I, the director of the Florida program for shark research, one of my responsibilities to manage the international shark attack fires. And I thought I'd just give a little bit of history about how these fires came to be. It was actually an event that triggered this pub, the USS Indianapolis, on July the 30th, 1945, was actually transporting pipes or a nuclear bomb, and so this was torpedoed by Japanese submarine, and the boat sank in 12 minutes. There was a communication error on the part of the Navy, so the Navy weren't aware that this boat had sunk until survivors were spotted from the air 4 days after the ship went out. So all the estimated 900 crew members who survived the initial sinking out of about 1,200 men, 316 was still alive when they were finally rescued after 4 days. So of the 900 crew members, 600 of those perished. They either drowned or dehydration, but many of them weren't actually bitten, and accounts from the people remaining said consumed by sharks. This event was terrible for the Navy, and it actually caused a terrible morale problem for the Navy, so much so that a lot of the seamen were more terrified of getting sucked into water than they were of having their boats sunk. So it caused a major problem in the Navy, and so the Navy thought, well, they'd try to focus on the problem and fix it. In 1958, they organized a panel called the Shark Search Panel, with a focus to develop effective shark deterrents that they could give to seamen so that if they were in water, they would at least cut sets so they were safe. And this was a program that was done jointly by the Navy and Leonard Schultz at the U.S. Smithsonian Institution, and at Cornell University. There was a professor at Cornell University called Perry Gilbert that had an interest in shark takeout. And the first deterrents were based on copper acetate, which showed some analogous in certain circumstances to some sharks. And to give it a sort of psychosomatic boost, they mixed it with bright nicotine dye, so that when the seamen fell into the water, they would deploy this a big cloud bright nicotine dye because they apparently they felt safe. At the same time, other researchers were looking at natural products. Particularly Jean Clark was looking at the Moses sole, which she had noticed wasn't consumed by sharks, and she found out there was a toxin that this particular sole produced, and she tried to develop it as a shark deterrent. And what happened, as happens with so many shark deterrents, is it shows some sort of efficacy, but it's not foolproof. It doesn't work across all the different species, and sometimes it works for one species in certain circumstances, but if the shark's particularly hungry, they'll ignore it anyway. So the Navy quickly decided that this was not going to be a fruitful approach. So they turned their attention really quickly to trying to document shark bites and the associated environmental data that occur simultaneously to better understand the behavior of the animals. So they sort of pivoted rather than make a deterrent. They wanted to understand the biology of the animals by documenting patterns. And this was really the origin of international shark attack files. And we claim, just because of American advertising, that this is the longest running scientific documented file of shark attacks that exist in the world. And so the timeline goes in 1958, as I just mentioned, the US Navy forms the panel with Leonard Schultz at Smithsonian, and independently, Perry Gilbert up at Cornell had this independent little shark attack file. In 1963, the Navy joined forces with Perry Gilbert and Cornell, and they combined the records, and the first sort of summary statements about patterns that were in the database they collected were published. In 1967, they then, all on paper records, they converted it, computerized it, and then in 1968, 10 years after the Navy initially funded it, the Navy pulled the funding. So now they didn't cut any funding, and the files were transferred to the University of Rhode Island, where John Mechanic would manage them, and Perry Gilbert then moved from Cornell University to take up the directorship at NAYLOR Brain. And they continued to collect child attack data as best they could with the resources they had available. And then in 1974, David Baldridge, who was a US Navy officer who'd actually been at the inception, wrote a fairly fresh book called Child Attack, which many people are probably familiar with, where they published what was known up to 1974 about patterns of behavior in different species. In 1988, the files were then moved to the University of Florida, where I am, Florida Museum of Natural History, where George Burgess, as my predecessor, took over the files. So that's sort of the history. It's a very sort of checkered history of lack of funding and moving things around and trying to cobble together some kind of a database. But it's persisted through time with different amounts of funding. The mission is very simple. The shark attack files identify the species that are involved in mites, if we try to, and that's actually much, much harder than you might think. Of the thousands of bites that we have records for, we probably have got reasonable identifications to species for less than a third of them. And then we try to identify the factors that lead to shark bites based on the patterns in the data, and then provide advice to minimize the risk, which is what everybody's here for, and to maximize safety, as all of the delegates that you put so far are interested in these missions. So we don't have a big budget. I'm a professor. I study genomics and genetics and population genetics, and we manage the data files with sort of like PhD students and myself. And we just don't have the resources, like Sarah was talking about, sharps opters to monitor all these features. So we actually rely on people who are reasonably well known, at least in the United States. So a lot of victims come up to us and say, you know, I was bit by a shark 2 years ago, I'd like to know what kind it was. And then we collect data. Then we also hear about it through the news, just like you do, but the difference between us and the general public is we then follow up. We talk to the journalists, we contact beach safety, we talk to the hospitals, we get medical reports, and then we then interview the witnesses and interview the victims when they're not minors, and we compile information with questionnaires, and the questionnaires about 200 variables, and they're always incomplete. We're lucky if we get more than 15 answers on a 200 question questionnaire. And then we add information from the beach safety guys who are fact-tested, and the police, and we get medical reports from the medical professionals. And then once we have those data, we then go to NOAA buoys, and we enter environmental data based on the weather stations, like tide, temperature, wind direction, and moon phase. And then I mentioned that species identification is tricky. And we attempt, when possible, sometimes injuries are so uninformative or terrible that you can't really tell which animal is responsible. But in certain circumstances, when the bites are fairly canonical, we can use information such as the distance between the tooth marks, the actual size and the shape of the tooth marks. If there's any skin tearing, so the species have proclivity to tear the skin, others just bite with very clean bites. We also see scratches on the surface, which are associated with certain kinds of sharks and not others. And then the depth of the injury and the width in the jaw gives us a good idea about the species of sharks. And we've been through all of the files. We have quite a lot of photographs from many, many injuries. And where we've got no species that are responsible, we've come up with these sort of canonical views of what the patterns of bites look like for different species. And so you've got a little about white sharks. There's very new white shark bites that look as clean as that one, and the guy still got his flip-flop on. But nevertheless, this is a summary, an artist's impression of the canonical look of a white shark bite. And then we also have a little left tiger shark and a bull shark in the top right, and then a black tips in the bottom right. Now, they don't all look like this. In fact, very few of them look like this. But this it's of instructive people so they get a sense of what might be going on. And I'm a population geneticist, so we have tried to swab injuries. So give swabs to Chiseki guys, they go in with the swab and they put it in a tube and they return it to us. And of course, any injury that's been swabbed has got 99.999% human DNA. And so we got all this human DNA to contend with. And so then we have shark-specific primers that we can amplify DNA just from the sharks. But the amount of DNA from the sharks is tiny. And so usually we don't get a hit. But when we do, we get very excited. But it's an amplification of a very small amount of DNA, and it could very well be environmental DNA and nothing to do with the injury. So it sounds all very sort of gee whiz and wonderful, but we have severe kind of reservations about the accuracy of the IUDs that we get from DNA. We also have to contend with everybody thinks they've been bit by a shark, but sometimes it's a barracuda or a bluefish or an eel or a ray. And then we have to ascertain, because we're biologists, we want to understand the animal behavior. And I tell people, if you want to learn about live behavior, you don't go to the circus and watch lions jumping through hoops. You go and you try to, hide behind the scenes and just monitor natural behavior as best you can. So it's very important for us to distinguish between provoked bites and unprovoked bites. Provoked bites are those which draw animals into an area at a higher frequency than they would normally be, or actions that elicit behaviors from the animals that are unnatural. And the most obvious one that is very intuitive are spear fishermen. When a spear fisherman is bitten, and they've got a stringer of wriggling fish generating vibrations in the water and blood, then of course the sharks are going to come in. They're going to try to steal the fish and offer to lodge the spear fisherman get bitten. This is assigned as a provoked bite. In the last 20 years, we've got a lot of ecotourism interest in baited shark dives, and this draws animals into an area, and sometimes people get bitten in the process, but more subtly, sometimes when the dive operator is not there, there's no bait in the water, and then trucks haven't been there for 2 or 3 days, the sharks but acclimated, they come back to whether it's baited food. They don't see any food. They may see the swimmer in water and bite that swimmer. I think that reverberates with what some of the findings that have been found in NUMED as well. I mean, you actually see these acclimated animals. And then the last category is people just being stupid. And you'd be surprised how many people do strange things with sharks because they want to have a sub-bait for their program. So we get all kinds of quite unusual bites from people doing silly things. And so on average, about 3/4 of the bites that we have in the International Shark Attack files are assigned as unprovoked. And it's a little bit tricky. Sometimes we have to sort of make a judgment call, and we're not always correct. And so we curate the interviews and questionnaires, news articles from various different sources, photographs, audio, video when we could get them, and medical doctor reports. We have HIPAA clearance so we can get access to medical reports for all of the victims. And we have to clear it with the doctors, but they're usually very helpful. And then we really rely on getting information from collaborators from all over the world, many of whom are right here at this conference. So collaborators in Australia, California, Hawaii, South Africa, New Caledonia, and Requins as well. And so without the rigorous collection of data from these partners, we wouldn't have an international shark attack file. We would have an American attack file, which wouldn't really be as useful. So we could not do this work without the helpful collaboration of many people in this room and people elsewhere that take quite a lot of time to really get things right and to interview people and to delve check bits. So we're very grateful for that. Thus far, we have about 7,200 individual investigations in the files. And most of them, as you can see on this map, being blacked out is the United States. That's where most of the reports are from. And then secondly, from Australia and South Africa, from Brazil. And you can even see, if I can get pointed, maybe I could go here. But you see where yield number Requins is. So there's quite a lot of bites from this area. But there's glaring gaps. We are missing a lot of information. We're pretty sure there's a bunch of bites in West and South America. I know because I used to live there. There's all kinds of shark bites in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Angola, Cameroon. There's all kinds of bites there. We have almost none. These guys are out there pure all the time fishing. I know they can leave it, but we don't have many data because they just start reporting infrastructure. And we're also missing a lot of data from Southeast Asia. So everybody here would say, yeah, that's understandable. They don't have infrastructure to be able to do the reporting. But it's worse than that. We miss a lot of bites in areas where we have very good reporting. So I view the International Shark Attack files as a sampling of all of the bites that happen in the world. We certainly don't have them all. We know of many bites in the United States when victims just, for whatever reason, they don't want to report it, they're shy, they don't want that, they just want it to go away, and so it's their personal choice, and we have known about it. And we're currently collaborating. I was literally 2 weeks before I came to Ramyon, I was contacted by a bunch of emergency room doctors at the Mayo Clinic, and they wanted to compare the records that they have in emergency rooms with the records that we have in ISAC. And it turns out that there are global databases of emergency room admissions, and they're classified as to whether they're dog bites or car crashes or shark bites. And so we're actually going to collaborate with the Mayo Clinic, they're leading this, and see how many bites we're missing, see if there's a regional variation, and see if there's temporal variation. And I fear that those 7,000 bytes, there may actually be more like 21,000 bytes. I have no idea how many, but I just want to be upfront. We are missing a lot of text. The data we have is as good as it gets, but it's really not that good. And everybody here will attest to that because they work with this kinds of data. And we anticipate that this will help us better understand how these incidents, how the reporting accuracy varies over space and time. So if we have a look at trends over the last 20 years, all the journalists, every time there's a shark bite, they say, why are shark bites up? And I say, well, they're up for today. Well, not for the week, and certainly not for the year, and not for the day. Really, there hasn't been that much of a change in shark bites. There's some oscillations, but this is what you'd expect for any stochastic process. There's not really that many changes over the last 20 years, but on average, at least that we have in the database, there's about 67 unprovoked bites, about 6 fatalities every year. But if you look over a longer period of time, there's clearly been an increase in bites. And there's an increase that sort of happens around the late 1980s. And the obvious question is, why? Well, we're not sure why, but many people may or may not know this, but Madison Avenue in New York, this advertising sort of Goliath, decided that they were going to make a push for extreme sports in the early 1980s to get people outdoors and doing rock climbing, and base jumping, and bungee jumping, and all these marine sports, and it really was pushed through advertising in the early 80s. And this has taken on to many parts of the world, and I now realize it when I look out of the hotel window that Requins is one of the places, and New Zealand with all the bungee jumping. So there's a lot of extreme sports here, and we think that a lot of the increase in bites is a result of these recreational water sports. And every year there's some new variant, foiling, different kinds of surfing, there's windsurfing, there was shortboard windsurfing, there's racing board windsurfing, and then there's also ecotourism when people like to sort of experience these animals underwater. And so there's a lot more people doing these sort of adventure type sports, which means more people in the water in an environment where these animals live, and so the chance of them interacting is higher. There's also been a sharp increase in connectivity, cell bars, people report all the time, and that's probably contributed to the apparent increase in bytes. So the question is, the first sort of set of observations looks like, the increase in bytes is real, and the second might be a reporting phenomenon. And so there are many different species that are involved in shark bites around the world, and as we've heard many times at this conference, that the top three are white sharks, tiger sharks, and bull sharks. And then in different parts of the world, different species are in different numbers. And these top three account for 67%, 2/3 of all of the unprovoked quiets for which we've got a species identity, and 96% of all fatalities. So these three basically account for all fatalities, well, essentially, except for a few minor ones. So we have a resource which you can copy down the URL if you're interested. We have an interactive shark map, where on this map you can actually, we'll see if I can maybe show here, is I just got the mouse button now, is you can slide these slides backwards and forwards and look at any particular period of time. And you can choose any particular species. So now we're just looking at white sharks, and then see if I can get that. So now we click type sharks as well as white sharks and full sharks. And then if we just want to look at fatalities, then most of these dots go away. And then we just get rid of the bull sharks. Now we're looking at just type sharks and white sharks. And now, so for just all the fatalities due to white sharks between 1900 and 2024. So you can explore this map if you want to see regional changes and patterns over time. But I'm warning you that this is just for unprovoked bites, of which we've got known species, right? So we have 7,000 observations, all 7,000 are in this database, and it's a useful resource for some people. So how do bites vary around the world? Well, if the species doesn't live in a particular place, it's not going to be involved in a bite. And so people have already mentioned this. The species ranges have a big effect on which species are responsible. Cutworms melanopterus, which occurs in the Pacific, is not going to be responsible for any bites in the Atlantic. And the black-nose shark, Cutworms acronoctus, is restricted to the Atlantic. And it's a feisty little animal and bites a few people, when that's not going to be accounting for anything in the Pacific. And obviously, habitat constraints some of the big influence. Thresher sharks are pelagic animals. They could potentially be dalitectors, but they're largely pelagic. And they live in an area in the open ocean where there's not too many people. And so there are no bites, essentially, from thresher sharks. Similarly, six-gill sharks are enormous, but they live at 1,500 feet. We've got no bites of people from six gills. And we've got no bites from places which are not frequented by people. So Greenland sharks are, effective predators. We only have one record of a bite on a human, and we think it's a scavenge. An Inuit's foot was found in a Greenland shark about 30 years ago. So, but these things, as everybody at this conference has mentioned, you need to have these two components: people in the environment and the risk associated with people and sharks in the same place. But there are some exceptions. I mentioned a situation where these pelagic sharks that were responsible for many of the deaths from the Indianapolis, but also that peculiar parts of the world where pelagic animals come super close to shore than they normally would. And these are places where there's a lot of people. And there's none more classic than the Red Sea. The Red Sea is essentially an extension of the Rift Valley's giant gouge in the Earth's crust. And it gets deep really quickly. So you just have to go up the coast for maybe 200 meters, and you're already at 1,500 feet deep. And what that means that these big pelagic animals have super close to shore, and things like the oceanic whitetail can actually be swimming very, very close to where people are. And they're large animals, and they're used to a pelagic environment, which is pretty sparse with food. So if they come across a beach when there's a whole bunch of people, they're curious and happen. So if we think about other aspects that influence shark bites, species diversity has a huge fact. So we look at pelagic versus continental habitats in the Atlantic, for example. Here's a map. This is from a website that we have. Look at this little box here, this little box. Basically, you can drag this box around the map. It's interactive. And you can see all the species that occur in the box. Oh, it's not behave. Yeah. But you can see these are all the species on right here that live in that box. So there's 14 of them. These are all pelagic animals like oceanic whitehead, blue sharks, silky sharks, sand tigers. Oh dear, I'm having a hard time with this. Getting this thing to work. But then you drag the box up to West Africa and look at species diversity goes from. Okay. As the box moves towards West Africa, it goes up from 15 animals to 95. And then you drag it back again and it's back to 17. These are all the pelagic animals. There's a huge diversity, like in coastal regions, right? So the species diversity is much, much higher with continental margins than it is pelagic sectors. Well, now let's have a look at continental pelagic versus oceanic islands, like Reunion. Look go to Pacific. Again, there's this little box. In that little box, you'll see that there's 15 matches, 15 species occur in that box. And they're all the same ones. There's blue sharks, silky sharks, makos, the dredgers. It's the same bodies that were also in the Atlantic. Now by gray metal box up to California, should I get this thing to work out, you'll see that this number of species goes up from 15. I'm going to drag it up to the comic California, and you'll see that the number of species goes up again to 97. And then we drag it back down again, and it's to 15. And now I drag it up to Hawaii, and there's 52 species in Hawaii. So what we've got here is a situation where oceanic island diversity is higher than pelagic, because pelagic diversity is not high chunks. 15, 20 typical species, really, not many. But oceanic diversity is higher than pelagic, but smaller than continental. Indian Ocean, where we are right now. Again, the little green box in the southern Indian Ocean. Again, we've got 15 matches, same pelagic species. These are the same ones over all the world's oceans. And then drag that little box all the way, and come here to work, all the way over to Reunion. And we've got 17 matches, and when you get to Reunion, we see 41 different species occur in Reunion. Why am I showing you all of these different? Well, because it has consequences for shark bites. The greater species diversity that are implicated bites associated with continental habitats relative to oceanic islands shows up in the database. This is the continent of the USA. Each of these different colors corresponds to a different species. The purple ones are white sharks, the green ones are Requins sharks, for the pink ones are tigers, and the bull sharks. This is Hawaii. It's almost exclusively tiger sharks in Hawaii. Not many different kinds of species. If we have a look at other continental areas, the USA, South Africa, Australia, similar flavor of trend, not exactly the same, and here's Brazil. So we see quite a lot of species diversity because continental margins have got a lot more diverse habitats, just based biology. Here's Hawaii versus Reunion versus New Caledonia. It's an oceanic island. Remember, they had about 40 species, which are the result of colonization. And we see that all three of these islands have got quite a lot of bites from tiger sharks of Hawaii and New Caledonia. Tiger sharks predominate, but as everybody's heard, the bull sharks, or the bulldog. Yes, the bulldog is the most prolific from bites right here in Reunion. But we see that there's not that much species diversity in these ibex. And this is a really weird thing. Yes, the second most common bite in Hawaii is this oceanic little shark that's about this big. It's a cookie cutter. And that's because these goopy Hawaiians have a sport where they like swimming between the different islands. And they do it at night because they don't want to get badly sunburned. So they swim 20 or 30 miles across, and the cookie cutters go, oh, look at that. And these people get these awful injuries, where that cord gets taken out of them by cookie cutters. So that's a very weird one. Nobbling somebody that is doing strike stairs. So if we have a look at the nabblers over time, so here we've got species diversity on the left, and the nabblers over time, we've seen different variants of these graphs. So Hawaiian, in 1963, numbers were very depressed. There was a young boy, Billy Weaver, that was killed by a tiger shark, and people sort of overreacted and fished all the sharks out, and then the numbers came up in the 1970s. There was a government program which maintained them, and that sort of went away. And now the bison are actually higher than they have been historically. In New Caledonia, we're seeing, as already been mentioned, there's an increase in shark bites, and it has an alarming trend upwards, but hopefully mitigation and research into this pattern is happening, and it's going to be addressed with hopefully technology collaboration with scientists from Rayon and his Rayon. And I wanted to make sure that I had all the data, so I talked to Mikhail and I said, hey, Mikhail, this is great. I've got all the data, but you didn't send me the data for 2000 to 2020, 2020 to 2024. He said, yes, I did. I said, we haven't been bites. He said, yes, that's correct. We just have one bite which was fatal from the making shot. So what we see is this period that people have been talking about here, the Renyok, where in 2010 to 2014, 2015 to 2019, where that was this terrible time where there were a lot of bites, and then you can really see dramatically the response to the program that's been implemented. So it's been super effective for making the beaches safer. And so now everybody's talking about, are there other things that we could do to modify it so that we can keep the same level of safety, but adjust the procedures that we use. So, and this is just for completeness, this is the numbers for the USA. So the USA stays steady, and in terms of bites over here. Australia stays steady. We talked about balance, so the number of bites, and it's a trade-off between mitigation and removing some of these animals. And here's South Africa, which is actually goes of a downwards trend. Yeah, but largely because of the work at the South Coast Islands. So take-home messages from these patterns that we see in this 6-year-old database is that oceanic islands like Reunion, with expanding tourism businesses, face quite different challenges than mainland operates. So on the good side, you have fewer species to really worry about. The bulldog is obviously some Reunion, but you could tether your approaches to the biology of this particular species, which is different in continental areas where you have different seasons and different species, so you need to have a species-specific approach. But on oceanic islands, you have a fairly restricted space to work with. And surfers want to go wherever the surf is good. If you're on a continent, you could tell that this beaches are good to go somewhere else. But that's more of a challenge when everybody gets surf and they want to be able to surf wherever they want. And so it's harder to shut down beaches when you have most of the coastline is a place where people want to enjoy it. So different approaches need to be deployed in these circumstances than in continents. The broader challenges for all of us is, as been mentioned many times, communication and education. Both public and the press. The press needs educated too. They usually start with the answers and then ask you to corroborate it. And you say, no, it's done like that, which is a bit of a challenge. And the press really does what one size fits all. They think all sharks are the same. And I tell people, I say, no, a tiger shark is about as different in an evolutionary perspective from a white shark as a hamster is to a dog. We don't have mammal bites, they're very different. And so the mitigation needs to be tailored to the biology of the animals. And I think that on islands, that's probably a little bit easier to do than it is in a continental setting. And the other thing is that scientists are actually complicit. They sort of describe shark attacks. And, the scientists wouldn't say, what are the mammal attacks like? So I'm like, about bears or mice, they're very, very different. And so a lot of us are guilty of making these collective arguments which are not particularly helpful. And different parts of the world have got very different challenges, and what works for one particular species in one region might not work as in another. It's really interesting that the same species may have different patterns of behavior in different parts of its range, and so they need to be taken quite specifically. So I'd just like to acknowledge everybody in this room that you all know who you are, that have been sending it lots of work to collect accurate data. It's very easy to collect crappy data, but it's a lot of work to really be careful and make sure that you double check everything and you get the information accurate. So we're really grateful for that. And this is one of my PhD students who works on gene expression and shot in rays that go from freshwater to saltwater, Joe Miguez, and he also manages the input of the data for the shark trials. So without him, my lab would be much less fun. So Joe does well the book. So I'm happy to take any questions.